Good morning. My name is Jerry Firestein. I'm the Senior Vice President here at the Middle East Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's events, which are designed to mark and reflect on President Biden's first 100 days in office and the strategies that have been deployed in regard to the Middle East. We're going to focus our attention this week on trying to understand and analyze what were the stated goals of the Biden administration as they came into office, what have been the actual decisions that they've made, what has the approach looked like, and how have events in the region affected the decisions of the administration. What does that mean for the way forward? Our opening conversation is with Acting Assistant Secretary Joey Hood and Elise Labott, and they will provide an inside look at the work of the Near East Bureau at the State Department. And following that, we will have two subsequent sessions that are going to bring together MEI scholars to take a look more closely at the strategic issues that have been facing the region, as well as the dynamics playing out in different countries and sub-regions. The discussions will draw from MEI's recent series of essays in the presidential briefing book, and you'll be able to find a link to that briefing book that's going to be posted in our chat shortly. Moderating today's opening session is Elise Labott, an old friend of MEI and a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine, a leading journalist covering U.S. Foreign policy and international affairs. Before joining Foreign Policy, Elise was CNN's global affairs correspondent. She reported from more than 80 countries with that network, traveling the world with 7 secretaries of state and interviewing many world leaders and newsmakers. Elise is the founder of 2.0 Media, a digital media platform that aims to engage, inform, and inspire youth to solve today's most pressing global challenges, and an adjunct professor at American University School of International Service. Prior to joining American University, Elise was a practitioner in residence at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. After I hand things over to Elise, Joey will kick off the session with brief remarks, followed by a moderated conversation with Elise, where she will take your questions through Zoom's Q&A feature. With that, let me hand over to Elise to begin today's program.
Thanks, Jerry. It's good to be here, and it's good to have all of you, and great to be talking so timely about the president's first 100-day agenda. Fresh off his speech from last night, we're very lucky to have Joey Hood, Acting Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs. I think there was a perception that U.S. engagement in the region might diminish in favor of other priorities, but we always find that the Middle East has a way of imposing itself on every U.S. president's agenda. So on that agenda, we'll be hearing from Jerry Hood. And Jerry, the floor is yours. Great to have you.
Great. Excuse me. And it's great to be with you, Elise. And I will note that you are not just an old friend of MEI, but also of the State Department as well. So it's great to be with you today, and great to be with Jerry. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but my kids used to have this song that they would sing at the 100th day of school. I won't sing for you, but I think it's an occasion that's practically worth a song. And I don't know if you're going to be flattered or outraged here, but I think a lot of what I'm about to say reflects very closely what MEI put in its briefing book at the beginning of the administration. So let's go through and just see where there might be similarities to that and differences, and then we'll talk about it. But as I get started, Elise, I'm reminded of a phrase from one of your recent articles, one of the few, by the way, I've had the time to read as I drink from the fire hose of this job. You said once in a generation challenge. And that's precisely what the new administration's interim national security strategic guidance addresses. And by the way, I'm really glad that they came out with it. There's nothing stranger for a foreign policy implementer than to get a national security strategy like 2 years into an administration, but that's often what happens. But here we've been given very quickly interim national security strategic guidance. For our foreign policy, that means we're guided by our commitment to the American people, to our enduring values of democracy, equity, and respect for human rights, and a stable, and this is the big change, rules-based international order anchored in innovation, transparency, and inclusiveness. It's been made clear that our foreign policy should benefit the American middle class. And as you all know, this position has generated a whole lot of analysis and speculation about what it all means, not least of which from us in the State Department. And that's very healthy. In the Middle East context, that means our engagement has to shift away from reacting to the crises of the day to offering sustainable partnerships that address regional and global challenges. And I have to apologize for the phone. It cannot be undone. So I'll just keep going until it stops. For example, American leadership in multilateral diplomatic efforts to resolve conflicts across the region can build on the recent normalization agreements between Israel and some of its fairly close neighbors to move us to a new regional approach based on economic integration and opportunity. That's exactly what we've been working on in the first 100 days, reinvigorating those partnerships and investing in multilateral diplomacy. That's slow, it always is. But as we know from books like Wisdom of the Crowd, when you get your friends together to talk about an approach, while it may take longer, you end up with a better decision in the end. Our policy in Yemen, it's a prime example of our renewed diplomatic commitment to working with the UN and other partners to end that horrible 6-year war. Jerry and I have both served there. We've left a bit of our hearts in that country. And I mean, it's just hard to imagine all the pain and suffering that has gone on there. And I'm just thrilled that one of the president's first acts was to come to the State Department and to name Special Envoy Tim Lenderking, who's been working closely with the UN Special Envoy to Yemen and to reach a ceasefire that transitions to what we hope will be some type of representative and sustainable intra-Yemeni political process. Similarly, the United States believes that security and stability in Syria are best achieved through a UN-led political process and not a sham presidential election that leaves Bashar in power after winning 99.8% of the vote. So we're working also to ensure justice and accountability, and most importantly, freedom for the tens of thousands of detainees still held by the Assad regime. We're also engaging stakeholders from a lot of countries at the highest levels on all sides of the Libya conflict to encourage restraint and to advance a political solution facilitated by the UN that benefits the sovereignty of Libya so that Libya can belong to Libyans again. The support of our partners and allies for the global coalition to defeat ISIS, yes, that's still around, and it's still really critical because there's still tens of thousands of ISIS people that pose a very real potential threat, not only to Iraq and Syria, but to Europe and the United States. So we need to continue our support for stabilization so people can return home and ultimately prevent a resurgence of ISIS. Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that the president has also committed to meaningful diplomacy that would have a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA. And then that would be used as a platform to lengthen and strengthen constraints on Iran's nuclear program, but also its support for terrorism and other issues of concern. And we believe the best way to do that is through our working with our allies and regional partners. And Special Envoy Rob Malley has been doing just that. He's in Vienna now even as we speak. And as part of our commitment to stabilization in the region, we're trying to advance freedom, security, and prosperity for all Israelis and Palestinians in the immediate term. And as my colleague, Deputy Assistant Secretary Hadi Amr likes to say, we're not going for a Nobel Peace Prize here. We are simply trying to improve life for Israelis and Palestinians. That's important in its own right, and I think is much more possible now with the normalization agreements that we have, which create all sorts of possibilities that didn't exist before. But also, it's probably the best means to advancing and preserving the prospects of a negotiated two-state solution in which Israel lives in peace and security alongside a viable Palestinian state. We'll continue our ironclad commitment to Israel's security, of course, but we're going to look to build on those normalization agreements and also the peace agreements that have existed for 30, 40 years to make those more of a warm peace and not so much of the cold peace that they unfortunately have been for much of that time. From Morocco to Iran, we talked about young people earlier. We've seen them standing up for their rights all across the region. They're demanding accountability. They're agitating for greater control over their own future and their own country's future. For example, and they're facing formidable opposition, sometimes even being killed, but they're still standing up. We see that, for example, when Yazidi women survivors face rejection from their own communities because their children were fathered by ISIS members who raped them. When the Syrian regime killed 7 people, for example, including children, in a recent strike on the Al-Atarab hospital in Western Aleppo, where there's 5.5 million registered Syrian refugees throughout Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, and another 6.5 million displaced internally. Whether it's human rights defenders or parents working day and night to ensure a better future for their children, these are the people of extraordinary courage who work tirelessly to advance dignity and freedom of expression. And those are the people that we are trying to support when they stand up to genocide, violence, and authoritarian regimes. And they're front and center in that interim national security strategic guidance that I talked about a few minutes ago. The president's going to try to hold ourselves to that same standard. That's why he's working so diligently on addressing domestic challenges of racial equity and violence, as well as the climate crisis, as well as strengthening our own democracy and putting the economy back on track. So when we hear leaders saying, hey, you know, where's my phone call? The president hasn't called me quickly enough. He's kind of busy. He's got a lot of challenges, and yet he has still given us a framework, a vision, and the tools to advance that vision in the Middle East. We know that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, the Middle East is dealing with as well, like climate change and all the others that I mentioned. So we have a tremendous opportunity as we grapple with those together, to work together, using and building upon the normalization agreements that I talked about, to integrate the economy of the region more and more to face those challenges. When Secretary Blinken, for example, chaired his first strategic dialogue with Iraq earlier this month, he made clear that our cooperation with Iraq goes beyond security, even though that's where all the political parties and all the militias and the Iranians want to keep everything focused. It turns out that a great deal of our strategic relationship with Iraq is based on our cooperation in economic reform, energy, the environment, health, and a lot of other aspects in terms of cultural exchanges and so forth. The US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, recently made a trip to Abu Dhabi. He met with regional energy and climate representatives about the future of the region as we move toward a zero carbon world, demonstrating how we can work together with partners to address global issues while offering opportunities for the American private sector as well. We continue to advocate for economic diversification and private sector-led economic growth across the region to create job opportunities needed to sustain that famous youth bulge we always talk about. Well, it's real. I know you've heard some of these statistics, but they're shocking every time we hear them. Nearly 2/3 of that population is under 35. That's expected to reach 580 million by 2030. According to World Bank estimates, the Middle East and North Africa region is going to have to create about as many jobs as there are American citizens, 300 million, to ensure the region's future social and political stability. They're going to have to do this by 2050. The answer to that doesn't lie in more government jobs where people go to offices and don't really do anything. Just like in the United States and any other advanced economy, it's going to lie in entrepreneurs starting small and medium-sized enterprises to drive that post-pandemic recovery. I hope that what I've managed to say here today, despite what many may claim, demonstrates that we remain committed to our partnerships with the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. Because, as Elise said, if you've ever had small children, you know what it's like. You can be holding them and they're talking to you. And if you turn your head away to do something else and they're not done talking, they will grab your face and they will move it toward you so that you're oriented back to them. And for some reason, since pretty much the start of human civilization, that is what the Middle East has done for humanity, bringing that focus back to them, whether on religious reasons or for economic reasons or for political reasons. So the Biden administration understands that. We're going to remain focused on the Middle East, but we're going to do it in a way that promotes and reflects American values. So we're going to work on getting more students from the Middle East back to American university classrooms as soon as the pandemic can allow, so that they can return home as they have for the past several decades as doctors and entrepreneurs and engineers and storytellers to innovate social change. We're going to work on mutual trade and investment so that we can have more free trade agreements than just those we have with Morocco and Jordan and Israel and Bahrain and Oman. We're going to work on growing our embassies and consulates across the region in smart ways. We're going to have them reach out through English language programs and journalist training to push back on disinformation that's infecting the media throughout the region and the world. And we're going to work on cultural preservation projects because the culture of the region is really a global heritage that we all share. Those are real bonds built over decades of trust and shared values, and I don't think that they're going to go away overnight. So that's where we are. I look forward to unpacking the discussion further. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Joey. That was a great scene setter and a great broad overview of your regional vision. As you said, I'd love to unpack some of this. And let's just start with the obvious. Look, I think there was a lot of when the new administration came in, given that the Trump administration did things very differently, that there's still a little bit of skepticism and concern that any commitments you're going to make to the region could be undone by a new administration. So how do you plan to kind of address that elephant in the room head on, to say that, this administration is trying to build something or pick up or however you want to say it, build something that will last and it's enduring?
Well, I think that's at least why you see so much focus on multilateral partnerships and on the slow work of doing things together, rather than just issuing a tweet and saying, this is the way it's going to be, or that's the way it's going to be. It is slower. It is frustrating. As I said, we've seen it just in the issue of, leaders wanting to reach out and make phone calls and receive visits, and that's all great. But we have to work on the pandemic. We need to make sure that we can do these things safely. We need to focus on getting our economic footing back on track. And we need to focus on things like ending the dying. You know, when you have hundreds of people dying every week in Yemen, that really needs to be your main focus, as opposed to, say, an investment deal somewhere else. That will be a priority, of course, but not at the same level as stopping the dying. So I think the administration has got its priorities right. And when our partners see that, I think they're reassured. And they also see us investing in things that have been, I think, rich veins of investment and of our friendship over the past 60 or 70 years, such as these university partnerships that we're working on, and getting students back into American colleges and universities. They like hearing that because many of the leaders in the region attended these schools in the United States, and they know how that changes your life forever. And those are the sorts of bonds that outlive any administration.
This is true, and I do want to get to you about the COVID issue, but I'll just say from my talks with diplomats, as I'm wont to do as a journalist, there is, an appreciation for what you're saying, the kind of thoughtful approach, but there is also a concern that when you say, leaders want to make calls, leaders want to reach out, that the administration is being a little cautious and a little slow. That is kind of combined with, that perception, as we talked about in the beginning, that even Secretary Blinken kind of argued on the campaign trail that in terms of time allocation and budget priorities, the US might be doing less in the region. And if you look at those priorities, China, Russia, these are places that are not, that they're not wasting no time in strengthening their ties to the Middle East. So there is, I think, a perception that there needs to be a little bit more urgency in re-engaging the administration. How would you respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that when you're looking at tough issues like China and Afghanistan and our future there, and Russia and what they might be doing in terms of hacking our computers and our elections. Sorry about that phone once again.
Chinese calling.
Those are really, really big issues. Putting the NATO alliance back on a firm footing, making sure that our relationships with Europe are strong and can withstand the meddling from Russia, and on and on and on. Those are really, really big issues. And the administration is not ignoring the really big issues in the Middle East. They went straight for a new policy approach to Iran. They went straight to a new policy approach to ending the war in Yemen, recalibrating the relationship with Saudi Arabia, not rupturing it, but recalibrating it carefully to reflect our values. The secretary has already completed a strategic dialogue with Iraq. And of course, with the Israelis, he's talking and meeting with officials there practically every week. So there has been a lot of activity, even though you haven't seen maybe the secretary logging the frequent flyer miles throughout the region that maybe some of his predecessors would have, in a more traditional way of saying, okay, we're going to launch Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, and then we're going to do this and that and the other. The administration's taking a different approach. It's going to look different. It has to, because of the pandemic, because of the economic downturn, and because of the climate challenge that we face, and the conflicts that we've got to end. So they're putting their priorities right, but that might not always mean, a traditional phone call or a visit with lots of happy pictures.
COVID-19 responses from the U.S. policy side in the region. How is the region looking to you? We're getting the kind of hints that there could be some crisis lurking in many of the countries in your portfolio. For instance, I just read an article the other day where Tunisia's health system is on the brink of collapse now because of COVID.
Yeah, we're seeing this across the world, of course, Elise, and we here in the United States remember those dark days of January, especially when our health system was under great strain. I always ask my colleagues when I meet them, what's it due to in your country? And in some places they'll say, well, it's wedding season. Well, it's a religious festival. It's this or that, and so you can always tie it back to some sort of social phenomenon where human beings just weren't going to be kept down any longer. They just got exhausted and they decided they were going to throw caution to the wind. And that in a pandemic comes with great danger. So what we've been trying to do is the United States doesn't engage in the sort of flashy public diplomacy that the Chinese government does. They'll fly into Baghdad with 50,000 doses of the vaccine on an airplane, and it's as if the world has just ended. Oh, I can't believe it. This is the greatest thing ever. The United States, meanwhile, donates $4.5 billion to COVAX, which is, I think, that purchases you something like over 100 million doses. But we don't get a whole lot of thanks for that as COVAX then delivers the doses to countries throughout the region. So we just do it in a different way. We're trying to strengthen health systems. So in Iraq, for example, we've helped rehabilitate a number of clinics. We've donated equipment, and none of that gets into the media because it's just not done in the flashy way. Because we're trying to build an infrastructure that'll withstand pressures like this, rather than just delivering something at the airport and taking a picture and walking away.
Right. Right. All right. Let's dig down into some of the issues that you mentioned. You talk about Saudi Arabia and the calibration. I think all of us are wondering, including the Saudis, like, what does that mean? And how is policy, we know about, kind of ending support for the war in Yemen, but beyond that, how is policy evolving to back up that recalibration?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think certainly you've seen a lot of talk about this in the media, but we're putting human rights at the center of our foreign policy approach as well. So that means every meeting with Saudis will be punctuated by points saying that we need to see activists treated more fairly. We need to see people let out of jail when they're not being tried and processed through a internationally recognized fair judicial process. We need to have American citizens who aren't charged with anything allowed to travel, and their families allowed to travel. So those things will be very much at the center of our conversations, rather than, oh, by the way, or not raised at all. So that's another way. And we're also looking at just getting back to normal, where a foreign minister talks to a foreign minister, and a defense minister talks to a defense minister, and it's not the defense minister talking to the president, for example. And so we're kind of recalibrating back to what we had before. Hopefully we can nominate and get confirmed an ambassador fairly soon as well, so that you'll have a full staff and regular interactions on the many, many, many things that we need to continue to have a relationship with Saudi Arabia on. I don't have to tell you and the people on this call, I'm sure, that Saudi is going to remain important for forever because of its geostrategic location, its hosting of the two holy sites of Islam, the hydrocarbons, which, I think it's probably true what one author recently said, basically, which is that the very last barrel of oil that's produced is probably going to be produced in Saudi Arabia, just because of how cheap it is to produce there, and the deep infrastructure that they've had there with American technology since the 1930s.
Right. Look, I want to get into more on Saudi, but on Yemen, you mentioned Tim, certainly one of our finest diplomats working on the intra-Yemeni process. So the internationally recognized government really unable to kind of consolidate power through the region. The Houthis are continuing their offensive on Marib and other places. They've claimed a number of attacks and drones on Saudi Arabia, and international investigations believe those missiles to be and the drones to be Iranian. in this push to end the war, have we underestimated the transience of the Houthis? And there's, I think, a little bit of a perception that in an effort to kind of recalibrate, as you say, and lessen our involvement in the war, maybe we've given the Houthis too much credit. They seem to be the ones right now that don't want to be talking.
I think that's right, Elise, on a number of levels. They continue their offensive, and so they, as long as they feel that they're gaining ground, why would they give up much in the negotiations at this point? They could stop the fighting. There could be a ceasefire right now, but they, as you say, continue their offensive on Marib. They're threatening a couple of million displaced people who did not want to live in Houthi-dominated territory there. And so we call on them every day to just stop things where they are, and let us get humanitarian assistance in all across the country where it's needed. And let's start talking about what a post-conflict government of some sort of national unity would look like. And of course, the Houthis would have their place at the table for that. They've been part of Yemeni society since time immemorial. But I think you're right. I think everyone underestimated the ability of the Houthis to drive on and expand. When I was living and working there, I certainly never would have been able to predict for you that they would come out of their mountain fastness and be able to not only take Sana'a, but move right across the north. I think, though, they're not 10 feet tall.
Can I put a finer point on that?
Please.
In our desire to kind of recalibrate with the Saudis, did we maybe lessen the pressure a little bit on the Houthis too much?
Well, what you may be talking about there is removing the terrorist designation. And that obviously that doesn't mean that we don't believe that the Houthis are involved in terrible actions sometimes. But having that designation.
Yeah.
Well, it may, but the harsh reality was that with that designation in place, no matter how many comfort letters the Treasury Department issued, no matter how many frequently asked questions we issued on our wonky websites, businesses and companies across the world just said, well, I'm not going to deal with Yemen then. Because they don't have armies of lawyers at the ready to navigate U.S. sanctions policy so that they can make sure that when they're selling a shipload of wheat, that it's not going to be considered sanctionable. So what the World Food Program told us was that those companies just said, that's it, we're not actually going to deal with Yemen, which would have caused a humanitarian disaster even beyond the world's worst humanitarian disaster that we already see. So distasteful though it may be, we cannot have that designation and also avoid a worse humanitarian disaster in Yemen. Sometimes as diplomats, we just have to do what we have to do to get things done. So that's with the Houthis. Yeah, there is plenty of blame that they carry. But I think once we find a situation in which there is no longer a active conflict between the Saudis and the Houthis, it's much more difficult then for the Houthis to rally support around them to fight the foreign enemy. And then you'll start seeing, remember how Ali Abdullah Saleh used to say that governing Yemen was like dancing on the heads of snakes?
Heads of snakes, yeah.
Yeah, well, those snakes are going to start biting the ankles and the shins of the Houthis pretty quickly. So that's the situation we're trying to get to, so that they feel pressure from the outside and from the inside to sit down, stop the fighting, and come to some sort of an agreement on governing Yemen.
Well, let me ask you about that. So Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made some conciliatory remarks, constructive things to say about a future relationship with Iran, wants good and special relations in his words. We know the two sides that have talked in Baghdad. How significant is this development, and can more dialogue between the two sides resolve many of these conflicts? Is that something you can encourage? both Saudi Arabia and Iran are kind of bogged down in the region, Saudis in Yemen, Iran in Syria and Iraq. How can the U.S., given the relationships in the region, play a more constructive role there?
My DNA as a diplomat requires me to say jaw is better than war. I'm always going to say that talking, almost always going to say that talking is better than not. And so we will, of course, support that dialogue, because you never know what you might be able to work out once you're sitting at the table together and talking about what's important to you and where your red lines are as well, frankly, because one of the things that we fear is that whether it's in the waters of the Persian Gulf or it's in one of these drones that flies over the border, there's going to be unintended consequences. Well, those small boats didn't mean to swarm so closely to that American ship. Oh, whoops, something happened. Or we didn't mean for that drone to hit exactly that spot in the airport where dozens of civilians were sitting waiting for their flights. That sort of thing can happen. And we need to be able to convey face to face in very real terms what the consequences would be for something like that, whether it's to the Houthis, to the Iranians. The Saudis need to be able to do the same things to the Iranians directly. And, the Iraqis have a lot of skin in this game, because they're often, the intersection without a stoplight there. Right. And I think what the Iraqis are subtly trying to do is put up that stoplight, at least blinking yellow, to say, think before you act here, whether it's Saudi or Iran. So we support it. I don't know how far it will go, because obviously the government in Iran for the past several decades has had a very, very active policy of supporting armed groups in other people's countries to try to keep things just unstable enough so that they feel that those countries are not a threat to them. But we completely disagree with it, obviously, because those countries end up being a greater threat to everyone. If the Iraqi government had been less sectarian and more focused on tying its country together, for example, ISIS probably wouldn't have gained the foothold that it did.
Right. Okay, that brings us to Iran. Obviously, you mentioned that Rob is in Vienna. My friends in Baghdad tell me that Bill Burns met with the Iranians there. Don't know how much you can tell us about that, but it seems as if now that talks are continuing, that at least the ball is still in play. Look, we know you're looking for something stronger and longer, as you say, which deals with Iran's ballistic missile program, the destabilizing behavior throughout the region, support for non-state armed militias. How do you incentivize Iran really to agree to put that on the table?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, but let me get to the first one first.
The Bill Burns part?
Yeah, just to reiterate what I think the CIA put out in a public statement, which is baloney, didn't happen. Okay. Yeah. But obviously, he did have very good discussions with the Iraqis, and that's very much worth it. How do you incentivize Iran? I think there's a couple of ways. Obviously, you show them those red lines, you describe those red lines brightly to them, as I talked about earlier, to say, we're no longer going to give you plausible deniability, as might have been done in previous administrations. We're not going to say, oh, gee, I'm not sure who was behind that attack on our personnel or our interests in Iraq. There are so many shadowy groups. Who can really tell? We're not going to do that anymore, because we know that even if somebody in Tehran didn't say, strike these people on this night at this place with these weapons, what they've done is they've created the conditions for this by financing and training and providing the weapons and guiding and growing these groups over the years. So when they do something against us, we will hold the Iranians responsible, and we need to continue to make clear that we will do that and the ways in which we might do that. And the president, back in February was pretty clear when he struck some targets in Syria and conveyed to the Iranians just those lines that I talked about. So that's one way that you incentivize them. And I think another way is to demonstrate what the benefits are for them of having a more stable, growing economy in places like Iraq. So they've got all sorts of economic interests in Iraq right now. If Iraq's economy was twice as big, it stands to reason that the Iranians would have, twice as many valuable economic interests in the country. So it can be of benefit to them. We're not saying that Iran shouldn't have good and normal relations with countries around its perimeter, but they should be normal relationships built on economic ties and cultural ties, and not, sending land attack cruise missiles to, to shadowy groups.
Is Israel, I mean, let's be honest, is Israel being helpful here with their attempts to sabotage Iranian facilities? Wouldn't it be preferable if the talks could be, just talks and not where people are attacking their facilities while you're trying to get negotiations started?
Well, I can tell you that we've had really close coordination with the Israelis from the beginning of the administration. And just, I think it was 10 days ago, I was in a meeting with our national security advisor and theirs. And, these conversations are long and detailed. And we need to have more of that, I think, to be able to coordinate what might be helpful and what might be unhelpful as we do our diplomacy, and the Israelis take their actions to protect themselves as they see fit in their national security. So it's not perfect yet, but we're trying to make it more perfect.
I'm going to take that as unhelpful. Let's talk about Syria. You talk about a UN process, and discussions are going on getting humanitarian aid into Idlib, and we're facing a Russian veto. I mean, look, there's a lot of talk about the disaster in Yemen, Libya, but Syria continues to just be a humanitarian catastrophe. And I feel like there's kind of movement away from focus on, and look, the Emiratis, reopened an embassy there. People are talking to Assad. He's not going anywhere. How do you improve the situation in Syria under these conditions?
Yeah, it is absolutely complex. But as I think you heard the secretary say at the United Nations recently, he gave a very passionate set of remarks about our commitment to taking care of the humanitarian situation there, because that's something that the United States does better than anyone in the world. We're uniquely placed to be able to do it. And so over the next couple of months, you're going to see a hell of a lot of focus on not only maintaining that border crossing at Bab al-Hawa for humanitarian assistance managed by the UN, but opening up at least 2 other border crossings as well, because it's even worse now. We've got COVID. How are you going to get all those vaccines in there through just one little border crossing? The reality is that even if the Assad regime was governed by angels, they just don't have the capacity to do all of the assistance that's needed throughout all of that disaster of a country on their own. So we've got to have these border crossings so that the United Nations mechanisms can do their work. Because again, even if things were just fine in Damascus politically, we can't just rely on NGOs either to bring cross-border assistance. This is so massive that it requires the multilateral organizations that we've built the UN for.
Let's talk on Libya, Lebanon super quick. What is going to be the U.S. posture there moving forward, do you think? I mean, we saw, a kind of different move under Trump. How do you see the situation?
I'm sorry, did you say Libya or Lebanon?
Lebanon.
Oh, in Lebanon. Yeah, well, I wish I could wave a magic wand and make Lebanese politicians care about their people. But that clearly isn't the case, because for months and months and months, you've seen it. They had a near subatomic explosion in their port. Nothing changed. They've had their currency crash. Nothing has changed. They've had people come out onto the streets in their thousands. Nothing has changed. No reform, no formation of a new government. I don't know what else it would take to make them care. But while we hope and pray for that to happen, we are going to continue to make clear what international assistance is going to be at the ready when they do choose to make reforms. Those are encompassed in the CEDRA initiative, and it's billions of dollars of assistance as soon as they start doing things like reforming the electricity sector and putting it under an independent regulatory authority, and doing the same with the customs and so forth, so that the revenues are then used by the state and not put into the pockets of party leaders.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Jordan. Oh, sorry.
One more thing, sorry. While we're doing that, while we're waiting for Godot there, we're also going to be feeding and medicating the Lebanese people. Because again, that's something that the United States does well, and it reflects our values and maintains those friendships and relationships that we're going to need when eventually the Lebanese political leaders do the right thing. So I think you'll see soon a recommitment to more humanitarian assistance. We're just working on what that looks like.
Let's talk about Jordan. We're talking about 100 days. Jordan is celebrating its centennial. And it's kind of unclear what's happening with the palace intrigue. But I think one thing is clear is that, look, King Abdullah is facing a lot of hardship between COVID, the economy, the refugee situation. And I would argue from diminishing support from, once very strong allies in the region because of the shifting political dynamics. He's in a pretty lonely position. What can the U.S. do to help stabilize the situation? There is some concern about democratic backsliding. Others see it a different way, that he's really just trying to hold on to the country. How can the U.S. help?
Well, he may be more politically isolated in the region. I don't know. But he definitely still has in his corner the most powerful country in the world. And that means something. It means more than the $1 billion of assistance that we provide every year. It means more than the very deep security assistance relationship that we have and the massive investments that we've made there. It also means that we're going to be helping with economic reform, with ideas, with gentle pressure where it's needed, with support through the mechanisms that we can bring to bear, but also taking care of, as much as we can, those refugees that, as you say, are really burdening the country. We tend to forget that it started with Palestinians, and then it was Iraqis, and then it was Syrians. So it's not just a recent thing. Jordan has taken in more and more and more people as refugees over the years. And it's a major, major burden. And you're right, when your country is dependent so heavily on tourism, and then you have a pandemic and an economic downturn and security issues around the region that are all discouraging people from visiting, it's like, it feels like a knockout blow. So we're trying to help the government prepare itself with those reforms for when tourism can come back, and also diversifying its economy so that it doesn't have to be so heavily dependent. And I think, again, with the normalization agreements, we have possibilities now that we didn't have before. One example might be, let's say, an Emirati financed water project from Jordan to Israel that benefits both Jordanians and Israelis, as well as the Palestinians. That's not impossible to imagine now.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, about the Abraham Accords. You've welcomed the moves, some of the concessions on the president Trump gave, particularly pronouncements on the Western Sahara. And we do kind of have some questions from the audience that the Biden administration has not restated Morocco's sovereignty. How do you continue to encourage these agreements and normalization in a way that stabilizes the broader region, also doesn't give concessions like that Western Sahara one, which clearly the Biden administration doesn't agree with, but is not a bypass around the Palestinians? Because and we'll get into this, I think there is a concern about the Palestinians' governance that I think, there's just a fatigue. There's just a fatigue. Other priorities, frustration with the Palestinians. How do you make sure the Palestinians are legitimately and not rhetorically included in these Abraham Accords?
That's our main challenge, I think, Elise. You've really put your finger on it. It's to move marginalized people wherever they are in the region to the center of our diplomacy, and particularly the normalization agreements to the extent that we can. So that might mean trying to figure out, finally, a solution that works for the Sahrawis and the Moroccans. It might mean a solution to problems for the Palestinians and the Israelis. Again, not Nobel Peace Prize territory of, a final agreement solving everything, but maybe just getting more access to water, maybe getting electricity cheaper and where it should be, maybe a health sector that is capable of vaccinating people, for example. So it's not easy, and certainly sometimes the Palestinians also don't make it easy. When you say, well, let's have a conversation and let's all sit at the table and talk about, well, I'm not going to sit at the table, because I don't support this normalization agreement. Okay, well, we've all moved on, so we need to find ways to talk about these things, and that's why it's important for us to have renewed diplomatic relationships with the Palestinians that really frayed and withered under the previous administration because of the subsuming of our consulate into the embassy to Israel and the closure of their office here in Washington and so on. And we need to work through rebuilding and replanting and, harvesting the fruits of that field.
Okay, that's fair. And I think the resumption of aid and contacts, opening of the office, all important. But we know elections aren't going to take place. No elections in 16 years. And you speak very eloquently about the democracy agenda. I feel like there's a whole generation of Palestinians growing up frustrated with their poor governance and rife with corruption. How do you get an engagement strategy that gets aid to the people, not the corrupt leadership, and really deals with these poor governance issues? I feel like a lot of times the Palestinians are able to kind of push that part aside because of the conflict with Israel. And whereas if we deal with the governance issue, they could be a stronger peace partner for Israel too.
That's right. And I think what you just said mostly could be applied to places like Yemen and Lebanon and other places where we provide assistance throughout the region. Often the governments are either non-existent, or we don't have relations with them, or we don't trust them with a red cent. So we have to, over the decades, put in the hard work to get to know non-governmental organizations, which ones we can work with, which ones we can trust, actually help them learn how to write grants, how to administer assistance. That's the sort of civil society that we invest in, and that has been helping us get assistance to the people who need it, whether it's in Syria or Lebanon or Yemen or anywhere else. And I think it's true of the Palestinian territories as well. It's not easy. It's often much more expensive than working through a well-run, efficient government. But
until you get a efficient government in the Palestinian territories, though, you're never going to get a deal because the Israelis don't want to deal. Obviously, there's transience there in terms of dealing. Abbas doesn't want to deal with Israel. He has no incentive to kind of end the corruption in his government. The Arabs are getting frustrated. I feel like I'm not taking away, certainly, the suffering of the Palestinians under Israeli occupation in any way. But I feel sometimes, just like in Afghanistan, people are so tired of the Taliban that they don't talk about Ghani's government. I feel like the Palestinians' governance issue is really one of the roadblocks.
Oh, I hear it from my friends all the time. I get all sorts of messages about people dying needlessly, because of corruption and inefficiencies and mismanagement. It's terrible. It has a human toll. But we can't really make much progress on those issues until we have an ability to talk to Palestinian officials and elites throughout society, and that requires us to have some sort of diplomatic representation to them, because diplomacy matters. I think we've seen it over and over and over, that when you're not talking to people, you don't have a whole lot of influence.
So we have a couple minutes left. I have a couple questions left. Let's see if we could get to them. Just super quickly to kind of button up the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We had a lot of Trump pro-annexation, returning, making a lot of pronouncements that have been kind of no-goes for the U.S. for many years. How do you move away from that, return to a traditional U.S. endorsement of a two-state solution while not, kind of undoing some progress that has been made with Israel?
Elise, we're bureaucrats at the end of the day. And so our work is done by memos that go up to our leadership saying, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to do. And we are literally working on memo by memo, day by day, going, okay, now let's look at this issue. How do we thread the needle, like you just said, so that we keep what good developments may have happened, but also reflect our values more accurately and create the conditions so that we can actually move forward. And sometimes that requires quite a lot of magic fairy dust, and sometimes a lot of creativity, and sometimes maybe grabbing a lawyer or two and locking them in a room and saying, you're going to give me an answer on how we do this. But it's not easy. We're trying to do a lot of things at the same time. And, we'll get there. It's slower than everybody would like, but, Rome wasn't built in a day.
Okay, we speak about the democracy agenda, and the administration wants to make, democracy a higher agenda item. We've talked about fighting corruption, authoritarianism, and advancing human rights as a core national security interest. So there's a lot of disappointment in the approach towards Egypt that, it's still kind of looked at in more of a security relationship, and the human rights, there's a lot of lip service paid to it, but not the, that as a core national security priority.
Well, lip service actually is one of the main weapons of diplomacy. The United States government coming out.
It's not backed up by policy. It's a little thin.
Well, it depends on what you're looking for. So, in diplomacy, as you know from your many decades of reporting on this, most effectively starts privately in saying, look, here's the changing situation. Here's what we're going to need. And a lot of times you can get done what you're seeking to get done in that fashion. It's not exciting. It doesn't make for good headlines, but people get out of jail. People's families don't get rounded up. Things happen or don't happen along the lines of what you're hoping to see. When that doesn't happen, you also need to come sometimes out publicly. And it depends, not talking about Egypt specifically here, but country by country and situation by situation, we're always very careful to talk to family members and to say, does it help for us to come out and highlight this case publicly, or is it going to hurt the case of your family member? So we make those calculations very carefully. And then either go out and talk very publicly, or we don't. Then you've got the legislative pieces where you have Senator Leahy, for example, saying, well, here's $300 million of assistance that I'm going to hold aside until we get answers on this. And that's very helpful as a tool for us to say, look, see, there are consequences. We can work through this. This is what we're looking for. We also have to balance between the celebrity activist cases of people who have plenty of access to the Washington Post editorial board and big media, and those people who are unknown to the rest of the world. We've got to try to make situations better for all of those people. conditions better for all of those people, because that's what reflects American values, we think.
When you talk about kind of rebalancing your priorities and this different type of engagement, how does Europe fit in? Are you going to ask the European partners to engage more in the region? Does that mean military employment stepping up, or do you expect the EU to be focused on Russia?
Well, the EU's got a lot of challenges, that's for sure. You've just named a few of them, but I think that their voice matters quite a lot to countries in the region when they start talking about human rights, when they start talking about possible sanctions. I think our sanctions only go so far. They are most effective, I think, when you're talking about cutting off large companies or governments from the US financial system, because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. But if you have situations where bad actors don't really care about their access to the dollar, they might care about their access to Europe. Their family home in southern France, or their kid going to college in Paris or something, or in the UK. So when our UK and European colleagues start talking and rattling their sabers on human rights and talking about sanctions, we have noticed that it does have quite an effect. And so we are working closely with them to try to see what we can do together to try to box in some of the leaders that we want to push in the right direction, because we have to have a relationship with them and we want to see them moving in the right direction. You talk about Egypt, you talk about security. I think we all saw with the Suez Canal incident the other day, that body of water is still really important to us, not just for the commercial shipping, but the US Sixth Fleet. If we want our Navy to be able to navigate safely and freely from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea down into the Indian Ocean, we've got to have good access, but we also need to be able to count on a partner that can keep us safe from the many, many threats around there as well. So when we may sell a radar to Egypt, some in the human rights advocacy community will say, well, that's an outrage. We've got to be able to balance what we really need from the Egyptians and on the security side, and what we really need on the human rights side. And sometimes we cannot mix those two, but we can find other tools. And no, we're not going to satisfy everybody all the time. But I think if we keep focused on this at the end of a 4-year administration, you will see improvements in our relationship with Egypt.
We're coming to a close. I have a question that I think our audience will love, but hopefully it'll be a helpful tool for everybody as they try to advise you on your policies. We have a lot of think tank people on the call. Everyone is always, we talked about the MEI briefing paper, always very helpful in terms of advising. When you look at the many, kind of think tanks that focus on the Middle East and what they produce, what is standing out to you right now? We already gave MEI their immense and well-deserved praise, but what stands out for you as the most useful, and where are there gaps in the research and analysis that you think it would be most helpful to fill?
That's a really good question.
Thank you, Brian Katulis, who I know is watching.
Okay, all right. Well, I would say one thing we just touched on is, what are the types of cases where public scrutiny actually helps, and which are the cases where public scrutiny, I'm talking about human rights issues, might make us feel good here on our side? We've beat our chest, we're strong on human rights, but actually ends up making situations worse for those people. What are the conditions, country by country, where by which we can judge what we should do in each case? I think I've never seen anything that looks at that, and I think that might be useful in us helping us figure out how to approach types of cases and types of reform. Reform is another one. All too often I get emails and messages and angry letters from people, Falan is in jail somewhere and it's terrible. Okay, we should absolutely try to do something about Falan. But like I said, what about the thousands of people who are in the same type of situation? How do we get reforms that will actually prevent that type of situation for those people and make it better in the future? What types of reforms could we push for that might achieve that? And not pie in the sky things, but things that seem just barely out of reach, that if we push really hard for, we might be able to get.
I want to say goodbye and let you go, but you're headed out on a major trip with Brett McGurk and some others. What are you looking to hear?
Well, first of all, we're looking to just continue to invest in those relationships. And as you know, there's nothing that replaces that face-to-face diplomacy. We want to hear that there is a recognition of our new approach, where we're putting human rights at the center of our foreign policy, and that our partners understand that, and they're ready to work with us on the many, many issues that we need to tackle together, from climate change to racial justice to putting the economy back on track, and finding new ways to warm up the old peace agreements with Israel, and to find what the possibilities and limits are of the new normalization agreements with the other countries. So, I would say that those are pretty much the goals.
Well, I know that the region is looking forward to hearing you put a little bit more flesh on the bones on your plans too. This was a great conversation. Joey, thank you so much for taking the time. Safe travels. Hopefully next year we can do it in person. And thanks to all of you for watching and for your questions. And I'll throw it back to Jerry.